The gravitational shear of the Jovian-class gas giant tugged at the hull of the Vanguard of Indifference, a vessel that looked less like a spaceship and more like a collection of industrial refineries welded together in a fit of desperate pragmatism. Inside the primary observation deck, Kalen stood with hands clasped behind a rigid spine, watching the swirling ochre and violet storms of the planet below. To the various alien species that made up the interstellar hegemony, humans were an anomaly of biology, dense, heavy-boned creatures from a high-gravity crucible who possessed a frighteningly high caloric requirement and an even more frightening tendency to survive things that should have reduced them to a slurry of organic compounds. Kalen was a prime example of this terrifying resilience, though at the moment he felt remarkably fragile. The hegemony had existed for 12 millennia, a stable, stagnant collective of 5 primary species who had long ago traded innovation for a comfortable, predictable peace. They navigated the stars using precise, elegant mathematics and ships that resembled spun glass. Then they had stumbled upon Earth, a world where the weather tried to kill you. The chemistry of the atmosphere was corrosive to 80% of known life, and the dominant species spent their free time jumping out of perfectly functional aircraft for the sheer adrenaline rush. The first contact had not been a war, mostly because the hegemony was too polite to start one, and the humans were too busy trying to figure out how the hegemony's faster-than-light drives worked so they could bolt them onto their own clunky frigates. Kalen remembered the first time an Atella emissary had stepped onto a human station. The Atella were spindly, avian-derived beings who moved with a grace that made humans look like bumbling boulders. The emissary had looked at Kalen, then a young junior officer, and asked why the humans insisted on carrying so much redundant mass in their skeletons. Kalen had replied that it was because the universe tended to hit back, and he liked having a frame that didn't snap under pressure. That philosophy was currently being put to the ultimate test. Deep in the core of the hegemony's central systems, a threat was emerging that their elegant mathematics could not solve. The Vorax, a hive-mind of biological machines that consumed entire star systems to fuel their own replication, had breached the outer rim. The hegemony's glass ships were shattering against the Vorax's brute force, and the peaceful collective was realizing that their refined civilization lacked the one thing necessary for survival: a predator's instinct for total, unmitigated violence. Kalen turned away from the window as the heavy pressurized doors hissed open. General Tarak, a Thraxian warrior whose species resembled upright, four-armed lizards with skin like obsidian, stomped into the room. The Thraxians were the hegemony's traditional defenders, but even they were reeling. Tarak's scales were dull, a sign of extreme stress in his people. He didn't offer a traditional greeting, instead projecting a holographic map of the sector of 7 suns into the center of the room. The map was hemorrhaging red icons, each one representing a lost colony or a destroyed fleet. Tarak pointed a clawed finger at a small, unremarkable system on the edge of the encroachment. He explained that the Vorax had bypassed the main defensive lines and were heading for a refinery world that supplied 60% of the hegemony's medical isotopes. If that world fell, the hegemony wouldn't just lose a battle. They would lose the ability to treat their wounded and maintain their biological stability. The Thraxian fleet was spread too thin to intercept, and the other species were already debating evacuation protocols. Tarak looked at Kalen with a mixture of desperation and a lingering, culturally ingrained disdain for the primitive humans. He asked if the human ships, those ugly, blocky things that smelled of ozone and recycled sweat, could hold the line long enough for a counter-offensive to be organized. Kalen didn't hesitate. He knew that the hegemony saw humans as the galaxy's janitors, useful for heavy lifting and dangerous mining, but too crude for high-level strategy. He also knew that his crew on the Vanguard were itching for a reason to show the galaxy why you never corner a creature that evolved to hunt mammoths with sharpened sticks. He told Tarak that the humans would go, but they wouldn't just hold the line, they would break the Vorax's momentum. Tarak scoffed, his throat sac inflating with skepticism. He reminded Kalen that the Vorax utilized focused gravity beams that could crush a Thraxian cruiser into a cube. Kalen merely smiled, a gesture that humans meant as friendly, but most aliens found deeply unsettling due to the display of predatory teeth. He told the general that humans were quite used to being crushed. They called it Monday. As Tarak left, still grumbling about the insanity of hairless primates, Kalen keyed the ship-wide intercom. He didn't give a grand speech about destiny or glory. He told his crew that there was a group of overgrown toasters trying to take the hegemony's medicine, and that the Vanguard was going to go down there and remind the universe that humans were the meanest things to ever crawl out of a gravity well. The transition to slipspace was jarring, a sensation like being turned inside out and then slammed into a wall. Human FTL tech was less sliding through the folds of space and more punching a hole in reality and screaming until you reached the other side. While hegemony crews often required weeks of psychological recovery after a long jump, Kalen's crew just drank more coffee and checked their weapon calibrations. On the bridge, Commander Vane, a woman whose face was a map of scars from a dozen different border skirmishes, reported that the railguns were hot and the point defense systems were slaved to the tactical AI. She noted that the Vorax were already in the system, beginning their bombardment of the refinery world's orbital rings. The Vorax didn't use radio or lasers to communicate. They used a synchronized psychic field that hummed in the back of Kalen's mind like a swarm of angry bees. It was a cold, hungry signal that viewed all other life as merely raw material for the forge. Kalen felt a surge of ancient, ancestral heat in his chest. It was the same heat his ancestors felt when they saw the shadows of wolves outside the firelight. It was the feeling of being the only thing standing between the dark and the things you loved. As the Vanguard dropped out of slipspace, the sheer scale of the Vorax swarm became apparent. There were thousands of them, ranging from tiny, dart-like interceptors to massive, chitinous hive ships that dwarfed the human frigate. The hegemony ships in the area were already in full retreat, their beautiful hulls scorched and broken. The Vorax turned their attention to the new arrival, sensing a different kind of prey. The first gravity beam hit the Vanguard's forward shields with the force of a falling moon. The ship groaned, the deck plates buckling slightly under the sudden increase in weight. To a Thraxian or an Atella, this would have been the end. Their light frames would have shattered. But the Vanguard was built with massive internal supports and dampeners designed for the high-G maneuvers humans favored. Kalen gripped his command chair, feeling the ship vibrate with the strain. He ordered Vane to ignore the interceptors and focus all power on the nearest hive ship. The human philosophy of warfare was simple: find the biggest thing in the room and hit it until it stops moving. The railguns fired with a rhythmic thud that vibrated through the very marrow of Kalen's bones. Unlike the elegant plasma arrays of the hegemony, which burned through armor, human railguns relied on kinetic energy, solid slugs of tungsten traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. When the first slug hit the Vorax hive ship, it didn't just melt a hole. It shattered the structural integrity of the entire forward section, sending ripples of shockwaves through the biological hull. The Vorax hum in Kalen's mind shifted from hunger to something that felt remarkably like confusion. They weren't used to something hitting back this hard. They were used to the refined, predictable energy weapons of the hegemony, not the primitive brutality of throwing rocks very, very fast. Kalen watched the monitor as a second and third slug tore through the hive ship's midsection, igniting the internal atmosphere and causing the massive beast to bleed glowing, pressurized ichor into the vacuum. Target destroyed, Vane reported, her voice as calm as if she were ordering dinner. The swarm is recalibrating. They're coming at us from all angles now. Kalen nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Vorax were swarming like locusts, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the Vanguard's point defense. He knew they couldn't win a war of attrition. They needed to do something so reckless, so quintessentially human, that it would break the Vorax's collective mind. He looked at the refinery world below, specifically at the massive orbital elevators that were currently being dismantled by Vorax harvesters. The elevators were held in place by massive electromagnetic tethers. If those tethers were cut while the elevators were under load, they would snap back like giant whips, releasing enough energy to vaporize anything in their path. It was a suicidal plan, one that would likely destroy the Vanguard along with the Vorax. But Kalen didn't see it as suicide. He saw it as an opportunity. He ordered the ship to dive into the atmosphere of the planet, using the thickening air to bleed off the heat of the gravity beams. The Vanguard screamed as it hit the upper thermosphere, the heat shields glowing white-hot. The Vorax followed, their biological forms adapting to the heat but struggling with the atmospheric drag. Human ships were aerodynamic by necessity. Vorax ships were built for the vacuum. In the thick soup of the lower atmosphere, the Vanguard was a shark in a pond of goldfish. Kalen waited until the swarm was fully committed to the chase, their hundreds of thousands of bodies filling the sky behind them. Then he gave the order. The Vanguard's rear railguns fired, not at the Vorax, but at the anchoring pins of the nearest orbital elevator. The pins vaporized, and the massive carbon nanotube cable, tens of thousands of kilometers long and under millions of tons of tension, snapped. The sound was not a sound, but a vibration that could be felt in the core of the planet. The cable recoiled upward, a whip-crack of pure kinetic energy that sliced through the Vorax swarm like a hot wire through wax. Tens of thousands of Vorax units were instantly disintegrated, their psychic hums silenced in a massive, collective scream of agony. The Vanguard was caught in the shockwave, tossed around like a leaf in a hurricane. Kalen was thrown from his chair, his head hitting a console with a sickening crack. For a moment, there was only darkness. When he opened his eyes, the bridge was filled with smoke and the red glare of emergency lights. Vane was slumped over her station, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, but she was already reaching for the controls. Kalen pulled himself up, his ribs screaming in protest. He looked at the main view screen. The sky was clear of Vorax. The few that remained were scattered and disorganized, their hive-mind broken by the sudden, violent loss of so many units. The Hegemony reinforcements arrived an hour later, a shimmering fleet of glass-like ships that looked utterly out of place amidst the wreckage of the battle. General Tarak's voice came over the comms, sounding uncharacteristically hushed. He asked for a status report, his eyes scanning the ruined hull of the Vanguard. Kalen, leaning heavily on the back of his chair and wiping blood from his lip, told him that the refinery world was secure and the Vorax had been discouraged. Tarak looked at the devastation caused by the snapped elevator cable, a scar across the sky that would be visible for generations, and then at the battered human ship that had caused it. He remarked that he had never seen a species weaponize their own infrastructure so effectively. Kalen just shrugged, though the movement made him wince. He told the general that humans had a saying, "If it's stupid and it works, it isn't stupid." As the Vanguard began its slow, limping journey back to the nearest repair dock, Kalen knew that the Hegemony would never look at humans the same way again. They had seen what the janitors could do when they were pushed. They had seen that while the Hegemony was built on the beauty of the stars, humanity was forged in the fire of the ground. And in the coming war against the Vorax, it was the fire that would matter. The repair docks at the Hegemony's central hub were a marvel of crystalline architecture, a floating city of light and precision. When the Vanguard of Indifference drifted into its assigned berth, It looked like a charred hunk of coal in a jewelry box. Human engineers, wearing grimy jumpsuits and carrying heavy wrenches, swarmed over the hull before the atmosphere had even fully equalized. They didn't care about the aesthetics. They cared about the integrity of the pressure seals and the temperature of the reactor. Kalen stepped off the airlock and was immediately met by a delegation of hegemony officials. They were a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes, translucent skins, multiple limbs, eyes that saw into the ultraviolet. They looked at him with a newfound curiosity, a gaze that felt less like looking at a subordinate and more like looking at a dangerous predator that had been invited into the living room. One of them, a high-ranking member of the council whose species was nothing more than a shimmering cloud of gas held within a containment suit, spoke through a translator. It expressed gratitude for the defense of the refinery world, but voiced concern over the unorthodox methods used. It pointed out that the destruction of the orbital elevator would take decades to repair and had caused significant environmental shifts on the planet. Kalen didn't blink. He told the council member that the Vorax would have dismantled the entire planet in a week, which would have taken much longer to repair. He reminded them that while they were debating the cost of repairs, his crew was mourning the 3 engineers who hadn't survived the shockwave. The room went quiet. The hegemony lived in a world of abstractions and long-term planning. They often forgot the immediate, visceral cost of survival. Kalen walked past them, his heavy boots echoing on the polished floor, heading toward the only place in the station where he could get a decent cup of coffee. He knew the war was just beginning, and he knew that the Vorax would be back, faster and meaner than before. But he also knew that for the first time in 12 millennia, the hegemony wasn't just afraid. They were hopeful. And that was the most dangerous thing a human could give you. The internal atmosphere of the repair station smelled of ionized ozone and the sharp, metallic tang of welding torches, a scent that Kalen found strangely more comforting than the sterile, floral-scented air of the Hegemony Council chambers. He sat in a small galley within the human sector of the hub, a place where the gravity was dialed up to a comfortable 1.2 meters per second squared, and the lighting was a warm, yellowish hue that mimicked a Sol-type star. Across from him sat Vane, her forehead now sealed with a translucent medical strip, her fingers dancing across a handheld terminal as she tabulated the damage reports. The vanguard of Indifference was currently missing 30% of its outer hull plating, and the secondary reactor was leaking isotopes like a sieve, but the crew was in high spirits. There was a certain grim satisfaction in being the ones who had finally drawn blood against an enemy that the rest of the galaxy viewed as an elemental force of nature. Vane looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the terminal, and noted that the Hegemony engineers were refusing to touch the railgun assemblies. Apparently, the idea of a weapon that functioned by physically accelerating a mass to relativistic speeds was considered barbaric and unnecessarily volatile by their safety standards. Kalen took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter liquid grounding him. He told her to let the human crews handle the weapons and the engines. The Hegemony could focus on the life support and the sensors, areas where their technology actually surpassed human engineering. The quiet of the galley was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a small, multi-limbed creature known as a skitter, whose people served as the primary bureaucratic backbone of the Hegemony. The skitter moved with a nervous, twitching energy, its many eyes focusing on Kalen with a mixture of awe and terror. It delivered a high-priority summons from the High Council, not for a debriefing, but for a strategy session. This was a significant shift in protocol. Usually, humans were told where to go and what to hit. Being invited to the planning stage suggested that the Hegemony leadership had finally realized their traditional doctrines were useless against the Vorax. Kalen stood, feeling the familiar ache in his joints from the high-G maneuvers, and signaled for Vane to come along. He wanted her tactical mind in the room, especially since she was the one who had actually calculated the tension limits on the orbital elevator cables. As they walked through the shimmering, translucent corridors toward the central spire, they passed groups of Atella and Thraxian refugees. The sight was sobering. These were the survivors of the systems the Vorax had already consumed, beings who had lost everything to a mindless, mechanical hunger. The council chamber was a vast, domed hall that projected a real-time map of the known galaxy onto the ceiling. The red stain of the Vorax encroachment had grown noticeably larger since the previous day. At the center of the hall stood the representatives of the 5 founding species, their various life support platforms and environmental suits arranged in a perfect circle. General Tarak was there as well, his obsidian scales polished for the occasion, though his expression remained grim. As Kalen and Vane entered, the ambient noise of the chamber died down. The shimmering gas cloud representative, who Kalen had learned was named Xylanth, began the session by displaying a series of data spikes recovered from the wreckage of the hive ship the Vanguard had destroyed. The Vorax, it seemed, were not just mindless machines. They were a terraforming project gone catastrophically wrong, an ancient self-replicating system designed to prepare planets for a species that had likely gone extinct millions of years ago. They didn't hate the hegemony, they simply didn't recognize them as sentient life. To the Vorax, the inhabitants of the galaxy were just organic impurities that needed to be cleared away to make room for the great architecture. This revelation did little to comfort anyone in the room. If the Vorax were operating on a pre-programmed architectural mandate, they couldn't be reasoned with, bribed, or intimidated. They could only be stopped by force. Tarak stepped forward, his 4 arms gesturing toward a cluster of stars near the galactic core known as the Eye of the Progenitors. He explained that the Vorax were congregating there, building a massive structure that appeared to be a central command hub or a planetary-scale forge. If that forge became operational, the rate of Vorax production would increase by an order of magnitude, and the hegemony would be overwhelmed within months. The problem was the Eye itself. It was surrounded by a dense nebula of volatile gases and intense radiation that fried standard hegemony sensors and disrupted their plasma-based propulsion. Their elegant, fragile ships couldn't even get close to the core without the hulls warping and the crews dying of radiation poisoning. Tarak turned his gaze toward Kalen, his eyes burning with a reluctant respect. He noted that human ships used thick lead and water shielding and relied on primitive, shielded fusion reactors that were ironically more resistant to the Eye's radiation than the sophisticated zero-point energy cores of the hegemony. Kalen studied the map, his mind already working through the logistics of such a mission. The Eye of the Progenitors was a death trap, a place where the laws of physics were twisted by the proximity of a supermassive black hole and the remnants of a dozen supernova explosions. To send a fleet in there was a gamble of staggering proportions. He asked Tarak what kind of support the hegemony could provide if the humans agreed to lead the assault. Xylanth responded, stating that the hegemony could provide the Aegis of Light, a prototype vessel equipped with an experimental spatial folding shield. This shield could theoretically create a bubble of stable space around a small fleet, protecting them from the worst of the radiation and the Vorax's gravity beams. However, the Aegis was unarmed and required a massive amount of power to maintain the shield, meaning it would be a literal sitting duck without a dedicated escort. Kalen looked at Vane, who was already running simulations on her terminal. She gave a sharp, curt nod. It was possible, but it was the kind of possibility that involved a 90% chance of total vaporization. "We need more than just one ship," Kalen said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "If we're going into the Eye, we're going in heavy. I want every human freighter, miner, and scout vessel within 10 sectors pulled into the line. We'll strip the mining lasers and bolt them onto the hulls. We'll fill the cargo bays with improvised kinetic mines. If the hegemony wants us to be their shield, they need to give us the scrap metal to build it. The council members murmured among themselves, their various modes of communication creating a cacophony of clicks, hums, and light pulses. To them, the idea of turning civilian vessels into warships was a violation of a dozen different treaties and ethical codes. But as Tarak pointed out with a sharp snap of his jaws, treaties didn't mean much to a hive mind that wanted to turn your home world into a parking lot. After a tense hour of deliberation, the council agreed. The humans would be given total authority over the construction and command of the improvisational fleet, and the hegemony would provide whatever raw materials and experimental tech could be spared. The following weeks were a blur of organized chaos. The hegemony hub was transformed into a massive shipyard. Human crews worked side by side with skitter technicians, creating a fleet that looked like it had been salvaged from a galactic junkyard. They took heavy-duty asteroid haulers and reinforced their frames with layers of ablative armor. They took high-speed courier ships and turned them into missile platforms. The vanguard of Indifference was repaired and upgraded, its railguns fitted with new magnetic coils that could fire rounds at even higher velocities. Kalen spent his days overseeing the training of the civilian crews. Most of them were miners and merchant sailors who had never seen combat, but they were humans, which meant they were naturally inclined toward stubbornness and a refusal to die quietly. He taught them how to fly in the high-G patterns required to dodge Vorax beams and how to use the eye's own radiation to mask their heat signatures. He watched as people who had once been rivals in the shipping lanes became a cohesive, if somewhat ragged, fighting force. During this time, Kalen found himself spending more time with Tarak. The Thraxian general was fascinated by human history, particularly the stories of lopsided battles where the smaller, more determined force had somehow prevailed. Kalen told him about Thermopylae, about the siege of Malta, and about the desperate defense of the Martian colonies during the early days of expansion. Tarak listened with a quiet intensity, his respect for the primates growing with every story. He admitted that the Thraxian culture was built on the idea of honorable, balanced combat, and that the Vorax's total lack of honor had left his people paralyzed. Kalen explained that humans didn't care about honor in a fight for survival, they cared about winning. He told Tarak that when a human is backed into a corner, they don't look for a fair fight, they look for a heavy rock. This pragmatism was the very thing the hegemony lacked, and it was the very thing that might save them. The night before the fleet was set to depart for the Eye, Kalen stood on the observation deck, looking out at the gathered ships. There were nearly 200 of them now, a motley collection of shapes and sizes, all painted in the dull, non-reflective gray of the human military. In the center of the formation sat the Aegis of Light, its crystalline hull glowing with a soft, ethereal blue. It looked like a diamond surrounded by gravel. Vane joined him, carrying 2 containers of the sludge they called coffee. She asked him if he really thought they could do this. Kalen didn't answer immediately. He thought about the Vorax Forge, a machine of such scale and complexity that it defied human comprehension. He thought about the radiation of the Eye and the sheer number of Vorax drones they would have to fight through. Then he looked at the crews working on the hulls of their ships, laughing and swearing in a dozen different Earth languages, and he felt a surge of that same heat he had felt at the refinery world. He told her that it didn't matter if he thought they could do it. What mattered was that they were the only ones who were going to try. The departure was silent, a ghostly procession of metal and fire slipping away from the hub and into the dark. There were no cheers, no fanfares. The hegemony watched them go with a sense of profound unease, realizing that their fate was now in the hands of a species they had once considered little more than clever animals. As the fleet entered the slipspace corridor that would take them to the edge of the eye, Kalen sat in his command chair and closed his eyes. He could already feel the psychic hum of the Vorax, a distant, vibrating hunger that seemed to grow louder as they neared the galactic core. It was a cold, lonely sound, but it was being drowned out by the rhythmic thrum of the Vanguard's engines and the steady breathing of his crew. They were a small flame in a vast, freezing dark, but as every human knew, a small flame was all you needed to start a conflagration. When they finally dropped out of slipspace, at the edge of the eye of the progenitors, the sight was enough to make even the most seasoned pilot gasp. The sky was a swirling vortex of neon greens, bruised purples, and blinding whites. Massive streamers of gas were being drawn toward the invisible maw of the central black hole, and the stars themselves seemed to be screaming in the ultraviolet spectrum. The radiation alarms on the bridge began to chime, a steady, rhythmic warning that they were entering a place where life was never meant to exist. Kalen ordered the Aegis of Light to activate its spatial folding shield. A ripple of blue light expanded from the Hegemony ship, washing over the human fleet. The alarms subsided as the shield stabilized, creating a bubble of relative calm amidst the cosmic storm. But the calm was short-lived. Out of the swirling nebula, the first Vorax scouts appeared, not in dozens, but in hundreds. They were different from the ones they had fought before. Their carapaces were reinforced with the same heavy minerals found in the eye, and their movements were more erratic, more aggressive. All ships, combat formation Delta, Kalen commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Keep the Aegis in the center, railguns on free fire. Don't waste ammunition on the small ones, let the point defense handle them. Focus on the harvesters. The battle began not with a bang, but with a series of silent, blinding flashes as the human railguns found their marks. The Vorax swarmed the shield bubble, their gravity beams lashing out like whips. The blue light of the spatial fold flickered and groaned under the assault, the Hegemony technicians on the Aegis struggling to balance the power loads. The human fleet moved like a single organism, a school of piranhas protecting a precious egg. The improvised warships, despite their clunky appearance, proved to be incredibly effective. The mining lasers, designed to cut through solid nickel-iron asteroids, sliced through Vorax armor with ease, while the kinetic mines created a deadly cloud of debris that shredded the incoming drones. But as they pushed deeper into the eye, the resistance intensified. The Vorax were not just defending a territory, they were protecting the heart of their expansion. Huge, monolith-like structures began to loom out of the gas clouds, the outer pylons of the great architecture. These pylons were thousands of kilometers long, acting as both anchors for the forge and massive defensive batteries. As the fleet approached the first pylon, it unleashed a pulse of energy that bypassed the spatial folding shield entirely. The pulse hit one of the converted human freighters, the Marianne, and the ship simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris, just a sudden, violent erasure of matter. Kalen felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The Vorax were using technology they hadn't revealed before, something that manipulated the very fabric of space-time. "Vane, find the source of that pulse," Kalen shouted over the roar of the ship's stress alarms. Vane's fingers were a blur on the console. She reported that the pylons were drawing energy directly from the black hole's accretion disk. They weren't just batteries, they were conduits. To take them out, they would have to sever the connection at the base, which was located deep within the most high-radiation zone of the eye. Kalen looked at the Aegis of Light. The Hegemony ship was already straining, its crystalline hull beginning to show hairline fractures from the spatial stress. They couldn't stay in the shield bubble forever. They needed a distraction, something large enough to draw the pylon's fire, while a small strike team moved in to destroy the conduits. He knew what he had to do, and he knew it was the kind of plan that would make the Hegemony Council faint with horror. He opened a channel to the entire fleet, his voice echoing in the cockpits of 100 different ships. He told them that they were going to play a game of bait and switch, and that for the next 10 minutes, every single one of them had to be the loudest, most annoying thing in the galaxy. The plan was a symphony of controlled destruction that no military academy in the hegemony would have ever dared to simulate. Kalen ordered the fleet to vent their secondary coolant tanks simultaneously, creating a massive, expanding cloud of superheated gas and radioactive isotopes that acted as a giant reflective chaff. To the Vorax sensors, which relied on precise gravitational and electromagnetic signatures, it was as if the human fleet had suddenly tripled in size and moved in 6 different directions at once. Under the cover of this artificial nebula, Kalen detached the vanguard of Indifference and 2 smaller, high-acceleration interceptors from the main body of the fleet. They dived into the gravity well of the nearest pylon, the structural forces of the black hole tugging at the ship's frame until the deck plates shrieked in protest. Inside the bridge, the artificial gravity struggled to compensate, leaving Kalen and his crew feeling 3 times their normal weight. Vane's face was pulled tight by the G-force, her eyes fixed on the fluctuating power readings of the pylon's base. She reported that the energy conduit was shielded by a rotating magnetic field that would shred any physical projectile before it could impact. Kalen knew that the railguns, for all their power, would be useless against a field that could deflect a solar flare. He ordered the 2 interceptors, piloted by volunteers who had spent their careers navigating the treacherous rings of Saturn, to begin the shepherd's dance. The small ships began to orbit the pylon at suicidal speeds, using their own localized warp dampeners to create interference patterns in the pylon's magnetic shield. It was like sticking a crowbar into the gears of a clock. The magnetic field began to stutter, the violet energy of the black hole's power bleeding out in erratic arcs. The Vanguard took a direct hit from a secondary battery, the impact throwing Kalen against his harness as the starboard sensors went dark. He didn't order a retreat. Instead, he told the weapons team to overcharge the primary railgun. They weren't going to fire a standard slug. They were going to fire a canister filled with a dense, superconducting liquid that would short-circuit the entire pylon's grounding system. The shot was fired at point-blank range, a streak of silver light that disappeared into the heart of the pylon's power core. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the pylon began to vibrate with a frequency that shattered the viewports of the Vanguard's auxiliary decks. The violet energy that had been flowing into the structure suddenly reversed its course, feeding back into the pylon with uncontrolled fury. The massive structure didn't just explode. It collapsed into itself, the gravitational anchor failing and allowing the black hole to claim its stolen energy. The resulting shockwave sent the Vanguard spinning into the deep nebula, the ship's internal systems flickering as the reactor struggled to stay online. Kalen, his vision swimming with dark spots, forced himself to look at the tactical display. The loss of the first pylon had created a blind spot in the Vorax's defensive network. The main human fleet, led by the Aegis of Light, was already pushing through the gap, heading toward the central forge. But the victory came at a staggering cost. The 2 interceptors that had performed the shepherd's dance were gone, vaporized when the magnetic field collapsed. Kalen felt the weight of those lives like a physical pressure on his chest, but he shoved the grief aside. There was no room for it in the eye. He ordered the Vanguard's crew to bring the engines back to full power, even if it meant bypassing the safety limiters on the fusion core. They were limping, their hulls scarred, and their internal atmosphere thinning, but they were still in the fight. As they caught up with the main fleet, the scale of the Vorax forge finally became visible through the thinning gas clouds. It was a sphere of dark, interlocking plates the size of a small moon, surrounded by a ring of harvesters that were feeding it the raw material of a dismantled planet. At the center of the sphere, a pulsing red light marked the primary assembly core. This was the womb where the Vorax were born, and it was the target they had come to destroy. The Vorax hive-mind, sensing the imminent threat to its heart, reacted with a ferocity that bordered on panic. The remaining drones stopped defending the outer perimeter and converged on the human fleet in a solid wall of metal and hunger. The Aegis of Light's shield was failing, the blue glow turning a sickly, flickering yellow as the spatial folding generators began to overheat. Xylant's voice came over the comms, a series of urgent, modulated tones that the translator rendered as a plea for time. The Hegemony ship couldn't maintain the bubble much longer. If the shield dropped, the radiation of the eye would kill every human in the fleet within minutes, and the Vorax gravity beams would tear the ships apart. Kalen looked at the wall of drones and then at his own battered fleet. They were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, their ammunition was running low, and their only protection was about to vanish. This was the moment he had trained for, the moment every human story warned about, the point where courage meets the impossible. He realized that they couldn't shoot their way through the wall. They needed to move the wall. He ordered the fleet to consolidate into a tight, wedge formation behind the vanguard. He told the commanders of the mining ships to dump their entire cargo of refined or millions of tons of heavy metals into the space directly ahead of them. Then he ordered the vanguard to fire its main engines at maximum thrust, using the ship's powerful exhaust to push the cloud of ore forward like a battering ram. It was a crude, desperate maneuver, a literal wall of flying rocks launched at thousands of kilometers per hour. The Vorax drones, programmed to intercept ships and missiles, were unprepared for a mountain of unguided iron. They crashed into the ore cloud by the thousands, their delicate sensors and propulsion systems crushed by the sheer mass of the impact. The human fleet followed in the wake of the debris, a silver needle threading through a storm of shattered metal. As they neared the forge, the Aegis of Light finally reached its limit. With a sound like a dying bell, the spatial folding shield shattered, leaving the fleet exposed to the raw, killing light of the eye. Kalen felt the temperature on the bridge rise instantly. The radiation counters began a frantic, high-pitched scream. He knew they had less than 5 minutes before the electronic components of the ships began to fail and the crews succumbed to lethal doses of radiation. "Target the assembly core," he roared, his voice cracking. "All ships, fire everything you have left. Don't worry about the return trip." The human ships unleashed a final, desperate barrage. Railgun slugs, mining lasers, and improvised missiles hammered into the dark plates of the forge. The outer shell began to crack, venting clouds of molten metal and sparks into the vacuum. But the forge was too large, its armor too thick. Their weapons were making craters, but they weren't reaching the core. From the bridge of the vanguard, Kalen watched as a Vorax harvester, a ship the size of a city, moved to intercept them. It was positioning its massive gravity beam to crush the vanguard and the Aegis in a single stroke. He looked at the ship's remaining munitions and saw that they were out of railgun slugs. The only thing they had left was the ship itself and the volatile fusion reactor in its belly. He turned to Vane and saw that she already had the self-destruct sequence pulled up on her terminal. She didn't look afraid, she looked determined. They both knew that if they rammed the harvester at full speed and detonated the reactor, the resulting explosion would be focused by the harvester's own gravity beam, creating a shaped charge powerful enough to pierce the forge's assembly core. It was the ultimate heavy rock. Before Kalen could give the order, a new signal appeared on the tactical display. It wasn't human, and it wasn't Vorax. It was the shimmering, elegant signature of a Thraxian heavy cruiser. Then another appeared, and another, until 50 Thraxian warships were dropping out of a high-risk slipspace, jumped directly into the heart of the eye. At the lead was General Tarak's flagship, the Claw of the Sun. Tarak's voice boomed over the channel, filled with a fierce, guttural joy. He told Kalen that the Thraxians had decided that if the humans were crazy enough to die for a galaxy that didn't even like them, then the Thraxians would be honored to die by their side. The Thraxian ships, despite their fragile appearance, were equipped with high-yield plasma lances that were perfect for cutting through the thick armor of the forge. They ignored the drones and focused their fire on the wounds the humans had already opened, their beams burning white-hot against the dark hull of the machine. The combined fire of the human and Thraxian fleets was finally enough. A massive rift opened in the side of the forge, revealing the pulsing, red heart of the assembly core. Kalen didn't hesitate. He ordered every ship to target that opening. The Vanguard fired its last remaining maneuvering thrusters, tilting its nose toward the rift. A final, concentrated volley of plasma and kinetic slugs tore into the core. For a second, there was a terrifying, absolute silence that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of space. Then, the red light of the core turned a blinding, brilliant white. The Vorax forge didn't just explode. It detonated with the force of a small star. The shockwave expanded outward, vaporizing the surrounding harvesters and sending the human and Thraxian ships tumbling like dice across the nebula. Kalen was thrown into the darkness once again, the last thing he felt being the sudden, miraculous cessation of the Vorax hum in his mind. The hive-mind had been severed at the root. When Kalen regained consciousness, the Vanguard was a tomb of twisted metal and flickering emergency lights. He was pinned under a collapsed bulkhead, his breathing shallow and painful. He looked around the bridge and saw veins slumped over her console, her chest rising and falling in a slow, ragged rhythm. She was alive. He reached out with a trembling hand and activated the short-range comms. He didn't hear the Vorax. He didn't hear the radiation alarms. He heard the voice of a human pilot on a nearby freighter, laughing and crying at the same time, shouting that the forge was gone. He heard General Tarak, his voice weak but proud, calling for a status report from all surviving units. They had done it. They had gone into the maw of the universe and walked out with their lives. As the surviving ships began to regroup, picking through the wreckage for survivors, Kalen looked out through a crack in the hull at the eye of the progenitors. The nebula was still there, beautiful and deadly, but the Vorax were gone. The great mechanical hunger had been stilled by the stubbornness of a species that didn't know when to quit. He knew that the hegemony would spend the next century trying to understand what had happened here, trying to quantify the human factor that had turned the tide of the war. They would write songs and build monuments, and they would probably try to go back to their comfortable, predictable lives. But Kalen knew things had changed. The galaxy was no longer a place of elegant mathematics and glass ships. It was a place where a feather, if thrown hard enough, could break a mountain. And as he watched the aegis of light begin to tow the shattered Vanguard toward home, he finally let himself close his eyes and sleep, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the dark was just the dark. The transition back to the central hub of the hegemony was a slow, agonizing crawl through the shallowest layers of slipspace, as the remaining human vessels were too damaged to survive the violent physics of a deep jump. The vanguard of indifference was being held together by little more than structural integrity fields and the sheer willpower of the repair crews who refused to let their flagship die. Kalen spent most of the transit in a medical pod, his body a map of deep bruising and internal fractures sustained during the final detonation of the Vorax forge. When he was finally cleared to walk, leaning heavily on a cane carved from a piece of his ship's own debris, he found a galaxy that had been fundamentally altered. The news of the victory at the Eye had preceded them, but it was not met with the jubilant celebration Kalen had expected. Instead, a heavy, contemplative atmosphere had settled over the hegemony. The realization that their survival had depended entirely on the barbaric, kinetic tactics of humans and the reckless defiance of a Thraxian splinter fleet had triggered a crisis of identity across the 5 founding species. Upon docking at the hub, Kalen was not greeted by a parade, but by a silent corridor of Atella and Skitter citizens who simply stood and watched him pass. Their eyes, usually wide with curiosity or narrowed in judgment, were now unreadable, reflecting a mixture of profound gratitude and an underlying, shivering fear. They were looking at a man who had commanded a fleet that weaponized the very laws of motion, a man who had looked into the heart of a cosmic machine and decided to break it with a rock. Vane met him at the end of the gangway, her arm in a high-tech sling that hummed with bone-knitting frequencies. She informed him that the council had called for an immediate emergency session, but this time, the invitations had been extended to every human ship captain who had survived the eye. The hegemony was no longer asking for a report. They were looking for a way forward in a universe that no longer felt safe under their old philosophies. The council chamber felt different this time. The pristine, crystalline aesthetics seemed fragile, almost translucent, as if the participants were seeing the cracks for the first time. Xylanth, the gaseous representative, appeared dimmed within its containment suit, its light pulsing in a slow, mournful rhythm. General Tarak was already present, his obsidian scales bearing the pale scars of plasma burns. He stood not with the other Thraxians, but near the human delegation, a silent statement of where his loyalties now lay. When Kalen took his place, the room did not fall into its usual bureaucratic silence. Instead, a series of holographic displays ignited, showing the aftermath of the Forge's destruction. The Vorax had not been completely eliminated. Without the central assembly core and the synchronizing hum of the Forge, the remaining swarms across the galaxy had reverted to a feral, disorganized state. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer an unstoppable tide. They were now a pestilence that could be managed, provided the hegemony had the stomach for the cleanup. Xylanth spoke first, its voice translated into a series of somber, resonant tones. It acknowledged that the human strategy had saved the hegemony from total extinction, but it raised a terrifying question. What would happen to the hegemony now that the primordial fire of human warfare had been unleashed within its borders? The Council was terrified that the human fleet, now battle-hardened and technologically augmented by salvaged hegemony gear, would become the new threat. They saw the humans not as heroes, but as a different kind of Vorax, one that didn't want to build a great architecture, but one that simply didn't know how to stop fighting. Kalen listened to the veiled accusations and the stuttering logic of beings who had forgotten that peace was a choice, not a natural state of being. He looked at Tarak, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and then he looked at his own captains, miners, traders, and explorers who had seen their friends vaporized in the eye. "You're afraid of us," Kalen said, his voice raspy but carrying easily through the hall. "You're afraid because we didn't use a mathematical formula to win. We used gravity, momentum, and a refusal to be erased. You look at our ships and you see weapons, while we look at them and see the only things that kept us alive when your glass cruisers were shattering." He stepped forward, the tap of his cane echoing like a heartbeat. He told the council that humans had no interest in ruling the hegemony. They didn't want the bureaucracy, the crystalline cities, or the endless debates. What they wanted was the right to exist without being treated as an inconvenient necessity. He proposed a new concord. The humans would provide the hegemony with a permanent sentinel fleet to patrol the borders and clear out the remaining Vorax pockets. In exchange, the hegemony would provide the resources to rebuild Earth's shattered infrastructure and grant humanity full sovereign status within the collective, with no restrictions on their technological development. The proposal sent the chamber into a frenzy of light and sound. To grant the humans sovereign status and allow them to continue their kinetic development was, to the council, like giving a toddler a thermal detonator. But the reality was undeniable. The hegemony's own military was in ruins, and the Thraxian forces were increasingly looking to human leadership for guidance. If the council refused, They risked a schism that would leave them defenseless against the next threat, whatever it might be. Tarak stepped forward then, his forearms crossing over his chest in a traditional gesture of unbreakable oath. He declared that his legions would stand with the humans, whether the council approved or not. He argued that the era of elegant stagnation was over, and that the universe had proven it was a place of teeth and claws. If the hegemony wanted to survive the next 10 millennia, it needed to learn how to bite back. As the debate raged on, Kalen felt a strange sense of detachment. He realized that the war had changed him, and perhaps his entire species, in a way that couldn't be undone by a treaty. They had tasted the scale of the cosmos, had seen the mechanical indifference of the progenitor's legacy, and had come out the other side. They were no longer the new kids on the galactic block. They were the veterans of a conflict that had nearly ended time itself. He walked out of the chamber before the vote was even called, knowing that the momentum of history was now on their side. He found Vane waiting for him in the corridor, looking out at the shipyard where the Vanguard was being stripped for parts. She asked him what was next. Kalen looked at the stars, which no longer seemed like distant lights, but like destinations. He told her that they were going to find out who built the Vorax, and they were going to make sure that whatever they left behind stayed buried. The human problem, as the Skitter bureaucrats called it, was not solved that day, but it was redirected. The council eventually agreed to the Concord, mostly out of a desperate need to maintain some semblance of order. Human ships began to receive the best of hegemony sensor tech and shield generators, while human factories on the Moon and Mars began churning out railgun slugs by the billions. A new kind of ship began to emerge from the docks, vessels that combined the elegance of hegemony aesthetics with the brutal, high-G durability of human engineering. They called these the Feather-class cruisers, a name that was a joke among the human crews but a mark of respect among the Atella. They were light, fast, and carried enough kinetic energy to crack a continental plate. Kalen was offered a seat on the High Council, but he declined. He preferred the bridge of a ship to the cushioned benches of a hall. He took command of the first Feather-class vessel, the Persistence of Vision, and prepared to lead the first patrol into the dead zones left behind by the Vorax. As he stood on his new bridge, feeling the familiar hum of a fusion reactor beneath his feet, he realized that the weight he had carried, the weight of his species' survival, hadn't gotten any lighter. He had just gotten stronger. The universe was still a cold, dangerous place, and there were things out there far older and hungrier than the Vorax. But as he looked at his crew, a mix of humans and Thraxians working side by side, he knew that they were ready. They weren't just the janitors anymore. They were the guardians of the fire. The first mission of the Sentinel fleet was to a system called Oros, where a Vorax harvester had grounded itself on a moon and was attempting to rebuild a local relay. When the Persistence arrived, the Vorax drone didn't even have time to activate its gravity beam. Kalen didn't order a long-range bombardment or a tactical siege. He simply ordered the ship to accelerate to 0.5 light speed and release a single, massive tungsten rod. The impact didn't just destroy the harvester, it turned the moon's surface into glass. It was a message sent not just to the Vorax, but to anyone watching. The humans were here, and they had stopped playing by the old rules. As the ship turned back toward the hub, Kalen sat in his chair and watched the stars. He knew the peace wouldn't last forever, but for now, it was enough. He had shown the galaxy that a feather, when backed by the heart of a survivor, could tip the scales of the universe. The silence of the Oros system after the moon-shattering impact was not the peace of a job well done, but the heavy, expectant pause of a hunter waiting for the next movement in the brush. Kalen sat in the command chair of the Persistence of Vision, his eyes tracking the dissipating heat signatures of the Vorax harvester. The new ship felt different than the Vanguard. It was more responsive, humming with a synthesis of human power and hegemony precision that made it feel less like a machine and more like an extension of his own nervous system. Vane stood at the tactical station, her new prosthetic arm, a gift from the Atella bioengineers, moving with a fluid, uncanny grace as she recalibrated the long-range sensors. She reported that the kinetic strike had been successful, but the sensors were picking up a residual echo, a lingering frequency that didn't match the Vorax hive-mind. It was a rhythmic, pulse-like signal emanating from the core of the moon they had just scorched, a signal that had only become audible once the Vorax machinery had been cleared away. It felt old, older than the hegemony, perhaps even older than the progenitors themselves. Kalen felt a familiar prickle at the base of his neck, the ancient instinct that warned of a predator lurking just beyond the firelight. He ordered the ship to maintain a high orbital station and summoned General Tarak to the bridge. The Thraxian arrived shortly, his obsidian scales shimmering under the new ship's amber lighting, his forearms twitching in a restless pattern. Tarak looked at the sensor data, and his throat sac inflated in a low, vibrating growl of concern. He explained that there were legends among the Thraxian elders about the architects of the void, a precursor race that had predated even the biological records of the galaxy. According to the myths, the Vorax were not the end goal of these architects, but merely the gardeners, automated systems designed to prune the galaxy of organic life before the masters returned. If the destruction of the Forge in the Eye had been a declaration of war, the strike at Oros had been the doorbell ringing in an empty house, and something inside was finally waking up to answer it. The signal from the moon began to modulate, shifting from a simple pulse into a complex stream of data that bypassed the ship's firewalls and manifested directly on the main view screen. It wasn't a language of words or symbols, but a series of geometric constants and universal physical laws, a mathematical greeting that carried a cold, terrifying intelligence. The data stream coalesced into a holographic projection of a star system that Kalen didn't recognize, a place where the sun was a dying red dwarf surrounded by a ring of artificial structures that made the Vorax Forge look like a child's toy. A voice, if it could be called that, resonated through the ship's internal speakers, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. It spoke of cycles, of the inevitable entropy of organic civilizations, and of the great reset that was now overdue. It thanked the humans for clearing away the cluttered hegemony and the malfunctioning Vorax, as they had inadvertently simplified the task of the architects. Kalen didn't wait for the voice to finish its monologue. He knew that when an entity starts talking about the inevitable end of your species, the best response is to find a bigger rock. He ordered Vane to trace the origin of the signal, not to the moon below, but through the quantum entanglement corridor it was using to broadcast. The source was located in the Andromeda Void, a place far beyond the reach of traditional hegemony slipspace drives. However, the persistence of vision was equipped with the experimental Void Jumper engine, a device that used the same spatial folding principles as the Aegis of Light, but amplified them by tapping into the ship's fusion core. It was a one-way trip for most ships, but humans had a long history of taking one-way trips and figuring out the return journey once they arrived. Kalen looked at Tarak, who was already signaling his own fleet to prepare for a jump that defied every safety protocol in the Hegemony Handbook. "We can't let them reach the Milky Way," Kalen said, his voice flat and determined. "If they're waiting in the void, we take the fight to the void. We don't wait for the Great Reset to come to us." Vane pointed out that the jump would likely burn out the primary injectors and leave them stranded in intergalactic space with no hope of rescue. Kalen merely smiled, that sharp, predatory display of teeth that still made the skitter crewmen flinch. He told her that humans had crossed oceans in wooden boats and reached the moon in tin cans. A little bit of empty space wasn't going to stop them now. He ordered the crew to batten down the hatches and prepare for a transition that would make the previous jumps feel like a gentle stroll. The Persistence began to glow with a violent violet light, the vacuum around the hull warping until the stars themselves began to stretch and tear. The jump was not a leap through space, but a violent excision from reality. For a period of time that felt like both a second and an eternity, the crew of the Persistence existed in a state of non-being, their thoughts and bodies smeared across the dimensions. When they finally slammed back into normal space, the ship groaned as if it were being crushed by an invisible hand. The view out the primary ports was a nightmare of darkness. There were no stars here, only the distant, ghostly smudge of the Milky Way and the overwhelming presence of the world engine, a construct of such staggering proportions that it spanned an entire solar system. It was a web of dark matter and metallic struts, a machine designed to harvest the energy of a dying star to power the systematic erasure of galaxies. Thousands of Vorax ships, larger and more advanced than any they had seen before, were docked along the struts, like parasites feeding on a carcass. "Battle stations," Kalen commanded, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the ship's straining systems. "Vane, find the primary cooling vents for that star harvester. Tarak, I want your cruisers to form a perimeter and keep those high-tier Vorax off our backs. We're going for the throat." The Vorax responded instantly, a synchronized swarm of drones launching from the world engine with a speed that exceeded anything the Hegemony had recorded. The battle in the void was a chaotic dance of light and shadow, with the human and Thraxian ships fighting for every kilometer of space. The Persistence took hit after hit, its new shields holding, but its hull beginning to warp under the intense gravitational fluctuations of the harvester. Kalen watched the tactical map, seeing his fleet being slowly ground down by the sheer numbers of the enemy. He knew they couldn't win a conventional engagement. They needed to provoke a catastrophic failure in the engine itself. He directed the ship toward the central aperture of the harvester, a massive ring of glowing plasma where the star's energy was being compressed into manageable streams. He told Vane to prepare a hyperkinetic payload, not a solid slug, but a canister filled with unstable antimatter harvested from the ship's own engine core. It was a move of pure desperation, a gamble that could vaporize the Persistence along with the target. As they neared the aperture, the voice of the architects returned, no longer calm and detached, but vibrating with a shrill, mechanical anger. It demanded to know why a brief spark of organic life would seek to extinguish the eternal order of the machine. Kalen didn't answer with words. He waited until the Persistence was within the event horizon of the harvester's magnetic field, and then gave the order to fire. The antimatter canister didn't just explode. It interacted with the compressed plasma of the harvester, creating a chain reaction that tore through the world engine's structural tethers. The dying red dwarf at the center of the construct, suddenly freed from its artificial containment, began to expand with violent force. The shockwave radiated outward, a wall of fire and radiation that swept through the Vorax swarm like a scythe through wheat. Kalen ordered the Void Jumper engine to fire one last time, using the energy of the explosion itself to punch a hole back into the Milky Way. The Persistence was tossed into the slipspace tunnel, its hull glowing white-hot and its internal systems screaming in a final, collective failure. As the ship tumbled through the dimensions, Kalen caught a final glimpse of the world engine collapsing into a black hole of its own making, the Great Reset, cancelled by the sheer audacity of a species that refused to be a footnote in someone else's history. When the Persistence of Vision finally dropped out of slipspace near the Hegemony hub, it was a ruin. The engines were dead, the life support was failing, and the bridge was a tangle of melted wire and broken glass. Kalen pulled himself from the wreckage of his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Vane, who was slumped against her station, her prosthetic arm sparking but her eyes bright with the fire of survival. He looked at Tarak, whose obsidian scales were cracked but who still stood tall, a warrior who had seen the end of the world and laughed. They were broken, they were exhausted, and they were the most dangerous things in the universe. Kalen knew that the architects were still out there and that the war for the soul of the galaxy had only just begun. But as he watched the Hegemony rescue ships approach, he knew one thing for certain. The universe might have been designed by machines, but it was going to be defended by the people who had the heart to break them. The recovery of the persistence of vision from the edge of the hub's gravity well was a somber, silent affair that lacked the frantic energy of previous repairs. The ship was no longer a vessel of war, but a hollowed-out monument to the sheer cost of defiance. Kalen sat in a medical bay that smelled of sterile chemicals and burnt insulation, watching through a small portal as the Hegemony's shimmering tugs hauled the blackened remains of his ship into the primary drydock. His body felt heavy, not with the comfortable weight of Earth's gravity, but with the accumulated exhaustion of a man who had stared into the eyes of gods and found them wanting. The Hegemony Council had fallen into a state of total paralysis upon hearing the report of the world engine and the architects. The realization that their galaxy was merely a garden for ancient, mechanical masters had shattered the last vestiges of their cultural confidence. They were no longer debating treaties or trade routes. They were staring at the stars and wondering which one would be the next to blink out. Vane entered the bay, her movements stiff from the cybernetic grafts and the lingering trauma of the intergalactic jump. She didn't offer a salute or a report. She simply sat on the edge of the diagnostic bed and handed Kalen a physical data slate, a security measure against the digital intrusion of the architects. She explained that while the world engine in Andromeda had been neutralized, the signal they had traced was only one of thousands. The architects were not a single fleet or a single station. They were a systemic presence, a network of hibernating machines woven into the very fabric of the void between galaxies. The destruction of the Harvester had delayed the Great Reset, but it had also signaled the network that the organic impurity in this sector had become a threat. The humans and Thraxians hadn't just saved the galaxy, they had poked a hornet's nest the size of a universe. Kalen took the slate, his fingers tracing the jagged lines of the sensor logs. He knew what the Council would say. They would suggest hiding, dimming the lights of civilization, and hoping the architects would forget they were here. "They won't hide," Kalen said, his voice a low rasp that filled the small room. "The Council will try to bury their heads in the sand, but the architects don't forget. They calibrate." Vane nodded, her expression grim. She noted that the human colonies were already preparing for a total mobilization. The miners in the belt were converting their haulers into kinetic torpedoes, and the scientists on Mars were working on a way to weaponize the very spatial folding technology that had nearly killed them in the void. They weren't waiting for the Hegemony to give them permission to survive. Humans had spent their entire history fighting for every inch of ground, and the idea of a great reset was just another challenge to be overcome with enough ingenuity and sheer, stubborn violence. Kalen felt a surge of pride that warmed the cold hollow of his chest. His people were at their best when the odds were impossible. The summons to the High Council came 3 days later, but Kalen didn't go as a supplicant or even as a commander. He went as a harbinger. The chamber was crowded, the atmosphere thick with the pheromones of fear and the flickering light of a dozen different species in distress. Xylanth, the gas cloud representative, began a rambling speech about the necessity of a galactic quiescence protocol, a plan to shut down all FTL travel and high-energy emissions for 1,000 years to avoid further detection. It was a plan of cowardice, a slow suicide disguised as a strategic retreat. Kalen stood in the center of the hall, his cane striking the floor with a rhythmic, metallic thud that cut through Xylanth's modulated tones. He didn't ask for the floor, he took it. He told the council that the time for hiding was over. He argued that the architects had already mapped every star and every planet, and that the only reason they hadn't arrived yet was because they functioned on a logic of efficiency. If the hegemony made themselves difficult and costly to clean, the machines would seek easier targets. "You want to turn off the lights and hope the dark doesn't see you," Kalen shouted, his eyes scanning the faces of the 5 founding species. "But the dark is where we come from. Humans didn't survive the predators of Earth by being quiet. We survived by becoming the thing the predators were afraid of. We made fire, we made spears, and we made sure that every time something tried to eat us, it died in the process." He pointed to the holographic map of the galaxy, now dotted with the blue icons of the new Sentinel fleet. He proposed a total reorganization of the hegemony into the Aegis Collective, a military and industrial union dedicated to one goal, the fortification of the Milky Way. He demanded that every shipyard, every refinery, and every laboratory be turned over to the production of kinetic weaponry and spatial disruption fields. He was asking them to give up their beauty, their elegance, and their peace to become a fortress. The reaction was immediate and violent. The Atella representatives shrieked about the loss of their culture, while the Skitters lamented the collapse of the interstellar economy. But General Tarak stood, his 4 arms outstretched in a gesture of absolute support. He declared that the Thraxian legions were already integrating with the human command structure. He told the council that he would rather die in a galaxy that fought back than live in a museum that was waiting to be demolished. The weight of the human and Thraxian alliance was too much for the council to ignore. They realized that the choice wasn't between peace and war, but between a controlled mobilization under human guidance or a chaotic collapse as individual systems panicked. With a collective, mournful pulse of light and sound, the council surrendered their authority. The hegemony was dead. The Aegis Collective was born. The years that followed were a whirlwind of transformation that the galaxy had never seen. The crystalline cities of the Atella were draped in heavy ablative shielding, and the elegant gas spires of Xylant's people were converted into massive sensor arrays. The humans led the way, their can-do attitude infectious and at times terrifying. They taught the other species how to weld, how to forge, and how to think in terms of ballistics rather than abstractions. Kalen oversaw the construction of the Feather Wall, a ring of thousands of automated kinetic platforms placed at every jump point into the galaxy. Each platform was loaded with a 10-ton tungsten rod and a fusion engine, a simple and brutal deterrent that the architects would find difficult to calculate. The galaxy began to hum with a new kind of energy, not the soft glow of a stagnant civilization, but the sharp, electric vibration of a species preparing for the fight of its life. On the 10th anniversary of the battle at the World Engine, Kalen stood on the observation deck of the newly commissioned Vanguard of Destiny, a ship that was 10 times the size of his original frigate and armed with a railgun that could pierce a small moon. Vane was at his side, her cybernetic arm now a seamless part of her body, her eyes fixed on the deep void beyond the galactic rim. They were waiting. The sensors had picked up the first ripples of a massive spatial disturbance in the intergalactic medium. The architects were coming, but they wouldn't find a garden of fragile glass and peaceful philosophers. They would find a galaxy of iron and fire, a collective of species that had learned the human lesson, that life is a weight to be carried with pride, and that a feather, when thrown with the strength of 1 billion hearts, can stop the tide of the universe. As the first mechanical harvesters began to drop out of the void, Kalen didn't feel fear. He felt a grim, familiar satisfaction. He keyed the fleet-wide channel, his voice reaching across thousands of light years to the crews of 1 million ships. He didn't give a speech about glory or the progenitors. He simply told them that the janitors were on duty and it was time to take out the trash. The railguns hummed, the fusion cores roared, and the first volley of kinetic fire lit up the dark like a new sun. The Great Reset had arrived, and humanity was ready to show the architects that some things in the universe were never meant to be deleted. The war for the stars had truly begun, and for the first time in history, the machines were the ones who should have been afraid.